Hi and welcome. This is going to be a video series on designing and crafting a Native American flute in Fusion 360 and on a CNC. In my case, it's an AVID CNC using Mach 4. Doesn't matter what CNC you use or what software you use, other than this is Fusion 360 centric as far as the modeling is concerned. But there's plenty of information that you could use to model this in whatever software you use. I believe this is going to be a 3-part series, maybe more if it gets too long, but I'm going to break this down into 3 parts. The first part's going to be the basic anatomy of the flute and what we need to know about it to model it. And I'm going to go over the tools that we need to make in Fusion. We're going to need to make a set of tools that help us to create the model. That'll make more sense when I get there, along with making the fetish that goes on the flute as well. A good starting point for you is a website if you want to learn everything you could possibly want to know about Native American flutes and crafting them. Is a site, flutopedia.com. Flutopedia.com. I'll put a link down below to this site, but basically there is just a ton of information here. Tell you everything you need to know about making a flute by hand. My video series is specifically on how to model one in Fusion 360 and then create the flute using your CNC. But this is a great resource. Another resource I use is a spreadsheet by Bob Grealish. I'll put a link to this spreadsheet so you can download it. There's a link to it also on flutopedia.com. So yeah, we'll get into this spreadsheet a little more later, but it basically lets you input a set of parameters. Everything in light blue here, you can input these parameters, and it will give you an output that will tell you things like how long your blank should be, how wide your blank should be, what your bore length should be. These are starting numbers because every flute needs to be tuned. At least the first one needs to be tuned to get it into the key that you're trying to achieve. And in the software here, we choose the key that we want it to be in. We choose from all the keys that he provides, which is pretty much everything you're going to want as a starting point, and then you input these parameters and it gives you your starting points for what your stock should be. The second half part of this sheet gives you the information you need on how big your holes are, your playing holes, and what their spacing should be. And we'll get into that in a little bit here. Okay, so let's take this apart. I'm going to get a cutaway view of this so that we can look at what the parts of the flute are. So here's the cutaway. This is what we actually model, and then we just mirror this to create the opposite side. This particular model has diamond inlays around the holes. Let's start up here at the top. You have a blowhole. And right after the blowhole is what's called the slow air chamber. You blow in here, the air mixes here, and it goes out the slow air chamber exit hole. On the top of the flute, and this will make more sense later if you don't already know, either on the top of the flute or on the bottom of the fetish, and we'll get into the fetish in a minute as well, is a flue that the air travels from the sound exit hole to the sound hole or fipple. So the air travels through the blowhole into the slow air chamber, out the exit hole, through the flue, and down into the sound chamber. Above the flue is the nest. I believe fetishes are often called birds. I believe that's why this is called a nest, is because the bird sits on the nest. I could be wrong. I'm just making a guess there. You'll see in my case, my fetishes are a horse. So I guess in my case, this is probably a stable or a stall, not a nest, but we won't argue. After the sound hole is the sound chamber. And then, of course, on the top we have what are fingering or playing holes that give us each of the notes in the pentatonic scale. The flute we're building here today is in the key of G. So when all the holes are covered, the note that's played is G4 in a G major scale, which is, I believe, G above middle C. Not important if you're not a musician, which I am not, but when all the holes are covered, you get the note of G. And so in the pentatonic scale, in the key of G, you go from G, if you open up the first hole and play with these 5 covered, you get the note of A sharp. Go down to the next hole, you get the note of C. Go down to D. In the pentatonic scale, the third hole is closed most of the time. And so we don't count that one. So you jump down to the number 5, and that's in the note of F. And then when they're all covered, you back to G again in G3, which is G2 above middle C, if I'm saying that right. Let's see. What else do you need to know? I think that's really it. Other important things to note are that affect the sound is wall thickness and sound chamber length. Your slow air chamber and blowhole don't really affect the key. There's a direct relationship between the thickness of the wall at the playing holes, the length of the sound chamber, the distance between the sound holes, and the diameter of the sound holes. We get into all of that. It's turns out to be quite mathematical and easy to do. So in my case, I've designed this flute in the key of G. The model is easily adaptable to any key you want to make it in, but the first one you make is tricky because you have to get it tuned right. But after you've made it, we're making these on the CNC, and once we know the diameter of these holes and their spacing, and we know what the CNC is doing in terms of carving our sound chamber, we can reproduce this over and over time and time again, almost perfectly without having to do any tuning on the holes or the length of the chamber. If you've gone to Flutopedia and you've read, then all of that makes sense, I think. So that's our basic anatomy. When I start to design anything in Fusion, any kind of a model, I like to start with defining my data. As you know, Fusion is parametric, and what makes this flute so easy to produce in any key is the fact that it's parameterized. So to change this to an A, I don't have to change my design at all. I just have to come in and change parameters to create a flute in the key of A, or the key of B, or the key of F sharp. It's fairly simple. But like I said, I like to define all of my parameters ahead of time. It helps me think through the process of what I'm going to create. So this is my set of parameters, and I'm going to run through them real quick. We got the sound chamber length, which we don't really know until we've made our first one. But the spreadsheet gives us a starting point. When we input our parameters up here, when we tell it we want a G above middle C, and we're using a router bit of 7/8, that's irrelevant to us. We're not using a router bit of 7/8, but that's what gets me to where it tells me on a round bore I've got an 8.875 bore, and this is the only one I use as the round bore. You'll see later that we don't actually have a round bore, but it's irrelevant. It doesn't really matter to us at this point. But what matters is that we tell it that we want G4 here, or whatever other key that we decide we want. We then tell it what our wall thickness is going to be, which we know from our model, which we will get to, is our wall thickness is our overall width minus our bore diameter. We'll set those parameters here in a bit. But to get our chamber length, we input these variables: the wall thickness, the flue depth, flue width, and the sound hole length. It has parameters for the plug length, the air chamber, and the mouth plus any extra. But they don't really affect these numbers down here, so I'm not really sure what these do. But anyway, this gives us down here, the important things to us is it gives us a starting blank length, and it gives us a starting bore length. Now, this bore length isn't going to end up being accurate because we're not really going to be 0.8750. Now, you can tweak your machining, I think, to get it to where it's a perfectly round bore. This model does not create that, and I just go with it. I'll explain that in a minute too. So these are starting points: bore length and overall length. Get back to the model. So my sound chamber length here I have set to 14 and 13/16. This is my tuned number. I've created quite a few of these flutes, and so it's just I always get the same thing. So I've set this to 14 and 13/16 because I know with what my CNC creates, this creates a perfect flute with no sound holes. The note it plays is a perfect G. But to get there, I have this parameter down here, extra chamber length, that I add to this for the first flute or two that I'm creating. And then to get it into G, the flute is actually a little bit longer, and I take little slices off of that until I get it down to where it plays a perfect G. Once I have that, then I can measure from the north end on the flute. North end is the mouthpiece, south end is the sound chamber opening, and I measure the length from the north side of the sound hole to the end of the thing, and I get 14 and 13/16. And so from now on, whenever I make a G flute using this model on my CNC with the bit of my choice, I always get a perfect G key flute. But to start, you're going to change this, and you're going to say plus extra sound chamber length, so that it creates one a little bit longer. I hope all that makes sense. I'm going to get rid of that now because I don't need that. Okay, and then I have my sound hole length. So the sound hole length is the length of the sound hole here from north to south. Sound hole width is how wide the sound hole is from east to west. Flue depth. This is only important if you're cutting the flue into the flute. If you're not, we don't really use it. We use it on the fetish instead. But in this case, we are cutting the flue into the flute. So that determines how deep the flue is between the exit hole from the slow air chamber to the sound hole. Bore diameter. That's how big we want the bore to be in the sound chamber. We also use that same exact bore width for our slow air chamber. Slow air chamber length. I've played with this a little bit. Some places say that 5 inches is great. I don't know what the ideal is. I've set mine at 4 and it's working, and you can set it to whatever you want. Changing the length of that does not change your sound chamber length. Increasing the slow air chamber I've experimented with does not affect the key of the flute down here. It might affect other tonal qualities. You might get richer or worse sounding. I don't know. It's like that's something I haven't played with yet. I probably will, but that's something I'll do in the future. The blowhole length, I've set mine to 2 inches. I'm not sure where I got that number for, but it works. One of the criteria for determining how long your blowhole in your sound air chamber is kind of a matter of aesthetics as well as balance and that sort of thing. The longer this is, the heavier it is. You might find that with a longer sound air chamber, you'll get a more balance. You'll shift the weight, or you'll get less, or maybe a shorter one. It increases and decreases the distance of your sound holes from your mouth. So, rather than playing up here, you're playing further down if you make it longer, etc. So there's a lot of factors that you can consider in where you put that. Blowhole diameter. How big do you want the blowhole to be? I've set mine to 3/8. That seems to be working, and it seems to be a pretty standard blowhole diameter. But you can experiment with bigger or lower. Flue length. This would be better named probably as the plug length. I'm going to close this for a minute. The plug is this section here. It's the same length as the flue, but it is the distance between the slow air chamber at the top and the beginning of the sound hole. And this is called the plug. I believe that you used to work with, like if you're working with a bamboo or something, it's already hollow, and they insert a plug, and so it's called a plug because you would push it in there to block the air, to force the air up through the exit hole into the sound hole. But anyway, that is the length of the flue and also the length of the plug. Overall width is how big do you want the outside of the flute. So that would be the diameter on the outside of the flute. Wall thickness is a calculation. So we're taking the bore diameter of 0.875 and subtracting that from the overall width and then dividing it by 2 to get the wall thickness. So that's just a calculated value. You never need to set that. Mouth taper distance and mouth taper angle are not used in the flute because I no longer try to create those directly in the model. I use a tool instead that we'll get to in a minute to cut the taper on the end of the flute. This taper, it's better to show you on the model. I think if I assemble this, you see it's got a taper here, and we cut that with a tool right here that we'll get to in a minute. The hole diameters and locations I'll get to in a second. Nest location, so the nest, we went over that nest is, or the stable, whatever you want to call it, is this platform that the block or the fetish or the bird or whatever you want to call it sits on. So this is a calculation. I've used the length of my blowhole, my slow air chamber, my plug or flute length, and the sound hole length, and then I added 3/8 of an inch to that too, so that it sets the nest 3/8 of an inch in front of the sound hole. The nest length then I've set to 3 inches, which you can be whatever you want to, but it's got to be long enough to come far enough back so that the fetish can sits on top and blocks air from going anywhere but from the exit hole and into the sound chamber. To me, 3 inches is pretty aesthetically nice and works for me, but you can make it whatever you want. I've already explained the extra chamber length. Total length is just a calculation of all the separate chambers added up together. The hole diameters and hole locations, we're going to go back to the spreadsheet to get what those are. They're directly entered from what we calculate on here. So once we've done the initial carving, when we initially carve it, we don't carve any holes. We're just going to carve out the, let's go back to the model for a minute. Let's close that. And let's take this back. Express the features. So we're going to carve out the blowhole, the slow air chamber, the exit hole, the sound hole, and the sound chamber. And that's all. It'll still be a square block at that point. Let's see, let's suppress this. So I'm jumping ahead a little bit here, but we've mirrored this now so that we got both halves. When we go to manufacture, we're going to cut out our inside. I'm going to set that to be the current one, and so this sets our stock, and we're going to cut out these chambers and the sound hole exits. Okay, and that's all. And then we're going to glue these two pieces together, but we're jumping ahead, so I'm going to get back over here and suppress that. All right, so as I said before, at least I think I said it before, there is a direct relationship between the wall thickness, specifically at the hole locations, whatever the wall thickness is, which it should be uniform all the way up and down, the distance between the holes, the diameter of the sound chamber, and the diameter of the holes. So you got to bring all of those things together to get the right note from the right hole. So hole size and hole placement, we can figure out mathematically exactly what to do, and I have. And so with the parameters we input from the spreadsheet, we get basically a perfectly tuned float. So the bottom half of this spreadsheet has the hole calculations. What we put in here is our measured length. Actually, the measured length doesn't even seem to affect this because I don't even have it set. But if you notice, if I put in 14 and 13/16, which is what I actually use, you'll see that these numbers down here do not change when I hit enter. It changes some things up here, but we're not concerned with those unless you're specifically trying to get a specific length bore ratio. Then that matters, but otherwise it does not. What does matter is your bore width, your bore height, your playing hole thickness, and your football thickness, I think, is the same. So we entered these values, and what I find when I carve mine on my CNC is that my height comes out to what I specified, 0.875, but when I carve it, and I could probably fix that by changing something like my stock to leave on the bottom plane. I could tell it to leave a little bit more, and I could probably get that to 0.875, but I don't mess with it. It is what it is. What I get is 875 or 7/8 on my height, but on my width it's 16th short. It's only 13/16. So I enter those values in here. My bore width is 13/16 or 0.8125, and my bore height is 7/8 or 0.8750. And my playing hole thickness is the 3/16 that I told it to carve. With those set, then I come down here and I set my hole diameters. And when I set these, it's going to calculate where to place that hole and what the distance is between the holes. The distance between the holes is important to us for playability, mostly. There's different schools of thought. Some people like to have evenly sized holes. They want all the holes to be the same size. Other people prefer the holes to be evenly spaced. I'm in that camp. I like the holes evenly spaced. I think it's easier to relocate the holes when you're playing to get back to where the hole is. If they're, my fingers aren't spread out and weird, and I don't have any holes that are really close together. But it's personal preference, and you can do whatever you want to in here, and it'll still come out perfectly tuned when you plug these numbers into the model. So to demonstrate that, right now I have my holes set here to various diameters in order to create as even of a spacing as I can get. So I'm either a little over an inch or just barely under an inch, but all my holes are as evenly spaced as I could get them, which creates different sized holes. I don't know if you can see this in the video very well. I'm going to put it up here, but like this hole is bigger than this hole. This is the smallest hole, but there are various diameters in order to create the pitch or the note that I need at that hole based on the spacing that I've asked for. So if you watch these numbers closely as I change this, you'll see that if I change, say, this one from 0.32 to 0.375 or 3/8, you see the spacing on this went up. The spacing right here went up to 1.5 inches. Now, if I decided that, I want evenly sized holes, I choose a size. Let's say 3.4. Okay, I'm going to put that in there, and then I'm going to copy that to the right. Oops, not 3.4, it's 0.34. Didn't like that, did it? And then I copy that all the way across to the right, and you see my spacing all changed. Well, now I'm at 1.25 inch, I'm at 1 1/3 inch, I'm at under an inch, I'm over an inch, and I'm only a little over 1/2 inch, 2/3 of an inch between these two holes. But I have evenly sized holes. Yeah, so it's your preference. I like my holes evenly spaced, so that's what I'm going to do. Now I'm going to try to undo all of the damage I just did. I think I'm back to where I was. Doesn't quite look right, does it? Not sure what I changed. No, I think they're right, yeah. So that's that. Then you take the number that we want out of here. The numbers we want what our diameters, our hole diameters, what we set our hole diameters to, and we want this line down here that tells us how far that hole should be from the end of the flute, the south end of the flute. I don't know if I've already mentioned this, but the flute holes are numbered for design purposes. The flute holes are numbered from the south end to the north end. So this is hole 1 down here, and this is hole 6 up here. So this is the distance for hole 6 from the end of the flute. So 9.9063 inches from the end of the flute. And its diameter is 0.313. So we go to our model, and we go back to our parameters, and we set our hole location to 9.9063, and we set our hole 6 diameter to 3125 is what it is. It's the rounding in the spreadsheet is set to only 3 digits. But so we take all of those numbers out of the spreadsheet and we plug them into these parameters, hole 1 through hole 6 and hole location through hole location 6. And that's all of our parameters. Then we can use those parameters to create our model, which is what we'll do. And I've already created the model, so I'm just going to step through it and explain what I've done, but I'm not going to start from scratch and recreate a model. Okay, before we get into the next section or the next part, I just want to go over the tools or some of the other things we need to create in order to model the flute. Some things like these shapes and depths are difficult to model directly onto our stock, the sound hole, the sound hole and the exit hole and the sound air chamber in particular. Those things are difficult. So I've created tools to use to cut these in to the model. Makes it much simpler and easier to model. So those tools are the let's start with the sound air chamber. So I've built my sound air chamber here. Or the mold for it, basically, using the same parameters. I think in this case what I should have done was I should have imported the model, and I will change this at some point and import the parameters from the model so that this changes when I change the model. The reason I didn't do that is because I used this same one in different flute designs, and it could change, and so it's I don't know. Anyway, it's got the same set of parameters. You'll see which ones when I go through it, which ones we use to design this shape. This is then used in the model to cut in this shape. And we'll get into that when we do the modeling. The other tools, where are we? Do I not have it? I guess I don't have it open, or it's off. So is a tool to cut in the sound hole. I don't cut in the whole sound chamber because that's easy to extrude. It's just a round semicircle, so it's easy to extrude. So I extrude the sound chamber either before or after I cut in the sound hole. This is really used just to cut in this piece, but this is used in order to create a joint. I need the whole shape. That'll make sense when we model it. Let's see, another tool we need is, so when we cut out the flute, we need a flute fixture, because when we cut the top, the bottom of this is flat. The stock is a square. It's not round, so it's square and it sits flat on the table, and we can cut the top and all the holes. And if we're doing the inlay, we can cut the inlay, and we can cut the nest and all that stuff we can cut because the bottom is flat, and we can tape it or glue it or clamp. We can't clamp it, but fix it to the table. But when we want to carve the bottom, we need something to hold this because it's no longer flat. So I've created a flute fixture, which is, I use the flute as a cutting tool to cut the top side into a block so that now the flute can sit down inside this fixture and hold it flat so that we can carve the round shape on the bottom and the nose cone. If that makes sense. Last thing you'll need is a fetish. Now, I don't remember if I've already said this, but I know I said that the fetish can either, all it needs to do is cover that section from the sound hole. It needs to cover the exit hole up to the edge of the north edge of the sound hole. So it could just be a flat block. It doesn't have to be a figure like my horse here. It could just be this bottom flat section. As long as it's perfectly flat on the bottom so that it seals the air into the flue, that's all you need. So you need to create something, and it can just be a flat block. Or you can create some kind of figure like my horse here. This, excuse me, happens to be my horse, Scotty. I pulled him in and modeled him. I used him as a canvas in order to shape him. So that's how I made my fetish. You can do whatever you need to do. One thing about the fetish, let me get that canvas turned back off, is I put a hole here to tie it down. I also have this flat platform, and I can tie it down from that too. So it's your choice. But you do need whatever you do, it needs to be able to take a string and be able to wrap it and tie it down to the flue. The other thing is like I said before, is that the flute can either be in the flute, like it is on this one, where the flue is cut in right here, so that the bottom of this fetish is just flat. I don't cut it into the fetish. But you can cut it into the fetish as well and leave the top of the nest flat. So this is modeled either way, depending on which type of flute I'm doing. I either cut this or I don't cut it. Okay. I think that's everything for this part. So next we'll get into modeling the flute itself. So thanks for being here, and hope it's been informative, and I'll see you in the next part. Take care.